All right, welcome. In this explainer, we are going to tackle a puzzle that starts with a really simple question. But trust me, it leads to some surprisingly deep and tricky places. And it all begins with a pile of sand.
So let's just jump right in with a little thought experiment. I want you to picture a massive pile of sand on a beach. It's clearly a heap, right? Yeah, I think we can all agree on that. And just to put a number on it, let's say this pile has exactly 1 million grains of sand. A million grains, yep, that is definitely a heap, no argument there. That's our solid, undeniable starting point. Okay, but what happens if you reach down and you pull out just a single tiny grain of sand from that pile? Well, of course, it's still a heap. Removing one little insignificant grain can't possibly be the thing that turns a heap into a non-heap. I mean, that would be absurd, right?
And this is where our simple logic starts to get us into trouble. Because if we accept that removing one grain never makes a difference, well, we can just keep doing that over and over again. We go from 999,999 grains to 999,998, and so on, all the way down until only one grain is left. But a single grain of sand is obviously not a heap. So what just happened? We started with a true statement, we applied a rule that seems totally logical, and we ended up with a conclusion that completely contradicts reality.
And that is the absolute core of the puzzle. There seems to be no logical, non-random place to draw a line. If you can't identify the single grain that makes all the difference, then how can you ever really say the heap is gone? This classic philosophical problem, it's called the Sorites paradox. And it reveals something really fascinating about how we use language and how we think. It shows how a whole series of tiny, insignificant changes can somehow add up to one massive, significant transformation. So here's the big reveal. The problem isn't with the physical sand itself. The sand is just sand. The real issue here lies in our language, specifically with the fuzzy, imprecise nature of a word like heap. To really get this, let's compare two kinds of words. So on one hand, you've got a precise word like triangle, a plain figure with 3 straight sides and 3 angles. That's a triangle. If it has 4 sides, it's not. The boundaries are crystal clear. But then you have a vague word like heap. There's no exact definition for how many things you need to make a heap. Its boundaries are just incredibly blurry. And once you start looking for them, you realize these vague words are absolutely everywhere. At what exact point does a person become bald? What specific height makes someone tall? At what decibel level does a sound become loud? So much of our daily language is built on these inherently fuzzy concepts. You can imagine, this paradox has been bugging philosophers for centuries, and it is not easily solved. The attempts to figure it out usually fall into 2 main camps for how to deal with these blurry lines. Okay, so one approach is to say there's a hidden line. People who believe this argue that there is a precise secret cutoff point. For instance, maybe 1,453 grains is a heap, but 1,452 is not. The line is real, it's just impossible for us to ever know exactly where it is. The other approach is to embrace the blur. This side says that for vague words like heap, things aren't always just true or false. There's a gray area where something might be a sort of heap. The answer isn't yes or no, it's maybe? Now, this might all seem like a fun philosophical game, but this problem of blurry boundaries has massive real-world consequences that we have to deal with every day in fields like law, ethics, and even politics. For example, take one of the most contentious debates there is. When does a fetus become a person with legal rights? Fetal development is a gradual process, a continuous series of small changes. There's no universally agreed-upon moment where a switch just flips and a non-person becomes a person. This is a real-world Sorites paradox, and the stakes could not be higher. Or think about economics. We often talk about taxing the rich, but what does that word even mean? If we set a cutoff, is someone earning just $1 less than that amount not rich? The line we draw is ultimately kind of random, but it has a huge impact on economic policy and the lives of millions of people. This even applies in the workplace. An employee's performance rarely collapses overnight. It's usually a series of small slip-ups. So at what point do those minor issues cross the line from needs improvement to a fireable offense? It's another blurry boundary and has very, very serious consequences. So this brings us to the bigger point. The Sorites paradox isn't just some riddle about sand. It's a reflection of how we get through a world that constantly pushes back against simple, clear-cut yes or no answers. From law and science to our everyday judgments, we are constantly forced to deal with concepts that have these fuzzy, blurry edges. Ultimately, the paradox of the heap is way more than an ancient riddle. It's a powerful tool that forces us to really confront the relationship between our language and the messy, complicated world it's trying to describe. It teaches us that while we're always looking for black and white certainty, a whole lot of reality just exists in shades of gray. Thanks for joining me for this explainer.